can do the stick from
the stick again from this morning. Yes.
Okay, welcome everybody to this panel on the business of news after advertising. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves when we start the conversation. I have to salute all of you, not only for your stamina and determination in showing up to one of these sort of late afternoon panels when you could be out enjoying the rain and a cup of nice British tea in Perugia. Instead, you are here, and I think you're probably here because you, like me as an academic, many of you as journalists, probably share my absolute obsession with money. That you are all interested in this question of how we fund journalism when the business models that sustain professional journalism in our parents' generation are so visibly waning away. I'll just say a few things to sort of kick off this discussion, and then I will, after my attempt to sort of distill some of the slightly pessimistic things that we should probably be talking about today, we'll turn to my fellow panelists for some examples of optimism, if you will, some examples of organizations that are beating a path and making a path by walking towards the future of what the business of news might look like in a world in which advertising will arguably play a smaller role than it has for much of the 20th century. So again, many of you as journalists are not necessarily intimately involved in the business of your organization, but obviously because your work is professional rather than a hobby or an avocation, you should be paid for it. And to do it well requires investment in your work, investment in the work of your colleagues, your editors, investments in the lawyers that vet your content and protect you from various forms of pressure from the outside. And just in sort of the thumbnail sketch of the history of that business, it's clear that for much of the 20th century, that business was heavily premised on advertising. For commercial broadcasters, almost all of the revenue was from advertising. And for newspapers in a country like the US, after the war, something like 80 to 90% of the revenues of many newspaper companies came from advertising. In Europe, a bit more like 50-50, but a very large share of the revenues of news organizations came from advertising. That was premised essentially on a set of simple facts of the market at the time. We as media users lived in a low-choice environment. This gave the publishers a high degree of market power because advertisers had very few ways of reaching us. Advertisers were never interested in the journalism or the news. They were interested in me as an audience member or you as audience members. And paying money to publishers was one of the few ways in which they could reach you. This gave the publishers enormous market power, and it gave advertisers very few channels to reach us. Now it's very clear we don't live in that world anymore. Advertisers have all sorts of other ways of reaching us. The advertising market is far more competitive, and for publishers, that means it's far less lucrative. The share of advertising goes to publishers is in very clear downwards trend because legacy forms of advertising like print and increasingly broadcasting are in decline. These are media through which we can reach our parents, but less and less the people in the room, and in particular younger generations. But also even in that market, the digital market, in which some publishers are doing well in the battle for attention, our attention is worth less because the market is more competitive. Publishers have low market power in this environment, and those entities, the platform companies that can offer cheap, targeted, unduplicated reach are the ones who really benefit in this environment from the advertising side. So the advertising subsidy that existed historically for journalism is in structural decline, and we can't expect advertisers to continue to unwillingly subsidize journalism the way they have historically. So what are we left with instead? Well, for some organizations, I think unfortunately it's clear that there are some who have just given up and are basically running a news organization on the model of what I think of sort of the West Texas oil field model of running a news company. It's essentially asset stripping. You're just pumping it for cash while you still have readers, minimizing cost, maximizing short-term profits, and eventually your publication will die with your last print reader. This is a model that we can see in some cases, that there are some owners are simply interested in extracting as much value as possible from the legacy business model and will then eventually, because they don't invest in the future, because they don't believe in the future of journalism, not only as a profession, but also as a business that enables that profession, eventually these titles will close. I am very glad to say that there are also many examples of publishers that don't operate on this model of the West Texas oil field model, where you just pump it dry and shut it up. And I'm joined today by people who have led such organizations or are leading such organizations in very different ways, and all of them are trying to develop new business models to empower their journalism. And I don't need to remind you of this, but let me just remind you of how powerfully we've seen the importance of this journalism that many of these organizations have done just in recent years. The journalism done by the organizations represented on the table, but also many others, we see it every day, holding tech companies to account, holding politicians to account, helping us as citizens understand the slow burn issues like environmental change and migration like our societies face. Journalism is as important as it's ever been. But of course, the precondition for that practice is that money is generated somehow to fund it. Now, I've said some depressing things about how hard that is in this environment, and for optimism, of course, I'm turning to my fellow panelists who each illustrate with their organizations different ways of thinking about what this business might look like in the future that will empower the professional work that all of you do as journalists. We have the Financial Times as an example of an organization that's privileging reader revenues increasingly. Of course, also advertising. Advertising won't go away. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it is a less important part of the mix than it's been historically. We have BuzzFeed that has been pursuing distributed scale and various forms of revenue sharing, in addition to, of course, also other sources of revenues, including the emphasis on the website. And then Gizmodo that has pursued a portfolio and a mix of different types of advertising and auxiliary revenues. I won't describe those models to you because I think we have the perfect set of panelists to do that. So I'll ask each of the panelists to speak in turn about the business that has underpinned the journalism that they have been involved in and how they see the future for that particular model they have been working on developing. Then we'll take a few questions back and forth, sort of discussions back and forth in the panel, and then open up for discussions. Because all of you as journalists, of course, have to think about what your role is in the business of news going forward. Because if you don't engage in this discussion about the revenue sources behind your professional work, then other people will be leading that discussion, and those people won't care as much about the importance of your work as you do, and we need you to be part of this conversation. So I will turn to Raju first. Raju, if you will introduce yourself, and then we'll go down the line of the panel from there.
Hi, Raju, Narisetti, CEO of Gizmodo Media Group for the next 12 days. My last day is 24th. So, the Gizmodo Media Group is a bunch of websites that are built around passion points for relatively young audiences. They include Gizmodo, which is a tech site, Jezebel, a feminist site, Lifehacker, which is around tips around how to have better lives, and then Kotaku, which is a gaming site, Jalopnik, which is a kind of a cars and culture of cars site, Deadspin, which is a culture of sports site. And then as part of the larger portfolio, we have the Onion Group, which is satire, AV Club, which is a music and entertainment site, and The Root, which is one of the largest African-American sites. So the portfolio is about, depending on how you count it, about 13 to 17 sites. Fairly large network of audience. Last month, US ComScore was about 116 million, which puts us larger than most of the sites that you can think of in the US. And they're all owned by a big television company called Univision, which is a Spanish television company in the US. So that's just a little bit of a context. I'll talk specifically about the Gizmodo Media Group and revenue. As you all know, and as Rasmus talked about, our industry was primarily built around two sources of revenue, right? Which is mostly advertising, but over the last 50, 70, 100 years, especially in newspapers, subscription revenue. So I come from I used to be at the Wall Street Journal, so I come up from a very strong belief that we need to have multiple sources of revenue, and those two were the kind of the way our industry looked at. And when we all went into digital, 15, 16, 17 years ago, and in the last decade, most publishers very conveniently abandoned reader revenue and thought that they will make money on advertising, they'll scale, and things will be great. And as you all know, things aren't great because the supply of web journalism is infinite, and anybody can start sites and add to the volume of places where an advertiser can go. So I have increasingly come to the belief that the way we can sustain and grow media companies is to look at multiple sources of revenue. And while an individual revenue source will be under stress for all the reasons you know, and that collectively, if you have anywhere from 4 to 7 to 9 different revenue streams, you can actually put together a growing, sustainable digital business. And I'll walk you through my own company's example. So if 100 is, I can't give you the specific numbers, but if 100 is my total revenue, currently 21 is my display advertising, which is your standard advertising units. 19 is what we call programmatic, which is essentially machines, if you will, buying ads across a bunch of sites, including ours. 10 is video, and the reason it's only 10 is because these sites historically have not had a lot of video, so it was a capacity issue. So 21, 19, and 10 get you to 50 out of my 100 in revenue, and that's what we think of as traditional advertising. And the other 50 is divided equally into 25 is native advertising and custom content and our own custom studios. And the other 25, which is one of the most interesting things for us, is e-commerce. We have a platform called Kinja Deals. It's part of all of our websites. And in the US, we are one of the largest content-based commerce companies. So I have 5 revenue streams that get me my overall revenue. And if you think about it, only half is advertising as we define it. The other half is commerce and studios. So each of these businesses is challenged. Advertising is challenged simply because Facebook and Google and others take majority of the advertising share. And video is challenged because a lot of your video views might be on YouTube or elsewhere, which is difficult to monetize, and I don't have a lot of capacity. But because I have half of my revenue coming from native advertising and custom studios, and out of which, and then a quarter of my revenue coming from commerce, I have the ability to kind of balance out what's happening out there. In commerce, we are heavily dependent on Amazon. So you could say that, don't you have an Amazon issue? And it's true, because just like we're dealing with Facebook and Google on the advertising issue, on commerce we have Amazon. But the nice thing about having a mix of revenue is that all these are under stress, but under stress for different reasons at different times. So you could actually have a bad year in advertising, but you could have an amazing year in commerce. Or you could have a strong year in your native advertising. So collectively, you can actually grow your business. We grew our top line by double digits last year. Each of these was performing differently. And I still don't have subscriptions as a revenue stream, or memberships, if you will. I still don't have an events. We have events, but we don't have a P&L based events business where I'm not looking at it as a profit opportunity. And that this year, there are plans to kind of do both those, a membership model and events as a business. So that gets me to 7 revenue streams. And potentially, I could do at least 3 more, right? All of my sites are very US-based, and we have some international franchise relationships. So that is a revenue source if we do more of that. There is a syndication opportunity because we are owned by Univision. Some of my sites translate well into Spanish. So we could potentially have a syndication opportunity. That's a revenue source. And finally, we have a platform called Kinja, which is a pretty open API-based, really flexible platform. So potentially, I could offer that to others who want to be part of the network. So all of a sudden, I have actually gotten 10 revenue streams. So I think that's the way increasingly we have to think about media companies. Each of these could be, some of these could be small, but again, as I said, while one is, if the economy is not doing great and if people are pulling back advertising, subscriptions or membership could offer a much more steady revenue base. So I think the more we think about how do we add revenue streams and how do we grow them, gives us a chance to kind of really not necessarily always think in terms of advertising or membership or subscription, and then what do we do with that? So I think that's how I look at media companies these days, saying that how many of these can we add and can we sustain our business? Thank you.
Thanks, Raju. Janine?
Sorry, hang on. Talk amongst yourselves. Hi, my name is Janine Gibson. I'm the UK editor-in-chief for BuzzFeed. And I'm a journalist, and I don't run the business of BuzzFeed. So I might be a bit low on facts, and I'll just try and tell you a story quickly, and then we can move on to some more facts. But before I joined BuzzFeed a couple of years ago, I worked for a legacy media organization. I worked for The Guardian for a long time. And I suppose the journey I would describe to you in terms of business models, and everywhere I've ever worked, despite me saying I'm an editor, I'm a journalist, I don't do business models, all we ever talk about is business models. The journey that I have seen has been one of endless diversification. And I would just like to describe what I think that looks like, because in the title of this panel we're talking about post-advertising. I don't think we're looking at anything like a post-advertising world. We're talking about ratios, right? You going from a 80% advertising world into a something considerably less than 80% advertising funded world for journalism. But the idea that we'll somehow liberate ourselves from the influence of advertisers, or whether it's voluntary or forced, is a bit of a myth. But where it is in the makeup of your revenue is an interesting one. And maybe 15, 17 years ago, as you described, when we all started worrying about the internet or being on the internet or being excited and enthused by it, it was largely an editorial initiative, I think. It was quite hard to get the commercial operations of newspapers interested in the internet. They were built around sales, whether that was ad sales or print copy sales. And their margins were very, very high. And the idea that you could sit in front of the head of commercial and say, we should not be worrying about whether or not we're selling that double page spread for 30, 50, 60,000 pounds. We should be thinking about how we sell some ads into this podcast for some pence. And we talked a lot about the transition from print pounds into digital pence, and what was the point of worrying about that. And mainly, the numbers didn't really stack up if you were a person with a phone selling advertising space. And your digital sort of evangelist in a company would be sitting there going, we need to do product links in the things we do. We write about all this stuff, and we could sell stuff off the back of that, and we could link out to Amazon. And the commercial team were going, why? Why would we do that? And of course, now we have skim links. We do it all the time, and we have initiatives where we do them. And we would say, we must have sponsorship for podcasts. They're very, very popular. People think, it's nice that they do a podcast. It's not really going anywhere, but it's nice, keeps them busy. And basically, the newspaper's business was based on, its relationship with the news agents that sold the newspapers and the media agencies that brokered the advertising deals. And it's really not for me to talk about where newspapers are now, but we can see that diversification has been forced on the print legacy media, and they now are looking at some form of moving from print ads into digital ads, some native, some targeted, some Google ads, some tabular, data-driven ads. From circulation revenue, we've got a number of models now that look like subscription or paywall or membership, but they're essentially reader-generated revenue. But it hasn't gone much wider, I don't think. I think it's a translation rather than a proper broadening out of the revenue. So when I look at BuzzFeed and what we're doing as an organization, it's obviously a much younger organization. It's digital native. It was founded as an entertainment and tech company with those skills and that knowledge. It didn't carry advertising. It was a native advertising company. It worked with brands. It brought the knowledge that it had from publishing to work with brands to tell stories. And over the last few years, as things have got really tough and for everyone in the media, it's had to diversify. It's been on a very similar journey. So we do take display advertising. We do partnerships. We sell things. We sell everything from fidget spinners with lip gloss in the corners to best-selling personalized cookbooks coming out of our Tasty brand, which is phenomenally successful, and then one-pot cookers with which you can cook the recipes that we show you, and we show you how to do them with your cookbook, and you know, we're not proud. And those are incredibly successful. For a while, we sold dustbins branded flaming pile of garbage because that was what Donald Trump gave us. We make feature films. We have a daily live show on Twitter that carries both sort of display advertising, like a TV ad, but also has a kind of version of native advertising where we do partnerships with brands to produce segments of the show. We're doing a show with Netflix. We have probably 5 or 6, I'm looking at Scott, who's in the front there, who almost certainly knows about at least 5 or 6 other things that I can't remember right now, but I'm sure we'll be able to talk about them. My point is that it's an extremely mixed economy, that it isn't an entertainment company that subsidizes news. News is pitching shows. It's more like, you know, quite substantial chunks of BuzzFeed are probably more like an independent production company than a publisher in lots of ways and in the way we're encouraged to think. Our CEO talks to us about 9 boxes, and please don't make me name them all because I can't. But the point is that it's a very diversified and flexible approach to the economy, and there is no way in which an individual at our company turns around to another individual and goes, "Can I get your attention around this idea?" And they go, "No, no, no, I can get much more money over here." Everybody goes, let's look at the lip gloss fidget spinner. Is that an interesting thing? Should we give that a go? Should we have a go at that? And I would say that's an attitudinal thing. I'm trying to be very optimistic, that says a young company that never got really very attached to anything in particular is quite a happy place to say, what if we did a daily show for Twitter every day, forever? And that's how we're getting through it, I think.
Sorry, but just before we turn to Renee and the FT, I mean, I think that attitude that Janine describes of commercial people not being interested in digital is one that was very prevalent in much of the industry and is still prevalent in some parts of the world, whether those are countries with very aging populations like Germany, where a few publishers may believe that they are different, or Japan for that matter, or countries in which a deep digital divide means that the pickup of digital initially was slower than in high-income countries like India, for example, where some publishers too may believe that they would remain different. To that I can only say that those commercial people may not be interested in digital, but digital is interested in them. Renee.
Thank you. So I am Renee Kaplan. I'm at the Financial Times, and like Janine, I'm also a journalist, but I do have a few more facts because I sort of work on the digital strategy side of journalism. I'm the head of audience engagement. And it's interesting because for a change, I have actually a very different perspective and point of view, because you've heard from sort of 2 essentially digital native companies, sort of digital pure players, and it doesn't come much more legacy than the Financial Times, right? We're over 100 years old. And both of them have made very interesting and optimistic cases, really, actually, for diversification of revenue streams. And I think everyone agrees that that is the only way to go, right? Nobody can rely on what had been the traditional model that Rasmus outlined. And so, and the Financial Times, like everyone else, is also trying to diversify. But what neither of them is particularly focused on, or neither of their publications or media are particularly focused on, is something that the FT is obsessively focused on, and probably actually would be the big hashtag word of this conference, which is reader revenue. I think that after diversification, everyone is now focused on the idea the only way forward, the only way for survival is to get readers to begin to pay for quality content, that quality content has to be paid for. And that's what the FT is doing. So the good news is that the Financial Times has actually always been in the business of making readers pay for content. It has always been a subscription business from the beginning, from its print days. And when it did transition to digital, like the Wall Street Journal, where Raju was probably at the time, actually, we were among the first to actually begin charging for content online, which at a time was sort of seen as quite heretical. But there's some good news, bad news in that, and that it's not an entirely happy story, because even as you try to get people to pay for stuff online, and try to transition from a model of print advertising revenue to digital advertising revenue, there's a very wobbly moment in transition where the numbers don't match up, as Janine was saying. And so just a year ago, pretty much everyone in the legacy media business was experiencing, in Europe at least, double-digit drops in print advertising. So 25, 26, 27, sometimes 30% drops in print advertising. And while digital advertising revenue was growing, it was a very small fraction. And what was also happening is that actually, not only was digital advertising revenue worth less than print advertising revenue, but it was going somewhere else than publishers. And it was going, and is still going, to Google and Facebook, who not only have the lion's share, they essentially own it. 80 to 90% of all digital advertising is on Google and Facebook. So it really does absolutely come down to diversification of revenue streams and getting people to pay for content. So on the good news side, the FT has in fact always been in the business of getting people to pay for its content, and that part of our business is actually going pretty well. I have to do pretty well because it's also a culture of very cautious optimism. But just in the past 2 years, the FT has gone over the halfway mark of its reader revenue. So now 60% of all of the Financial Times' revenue comes from our content, comes from people or actually paying for the content, which is pretty encouraging, actually, in a world in which there's so much free content out there, and actually in a world also in which the FT is very expensive content. A couple of other things that are worth sort of noting, though, about what that means for the journalism and what that means for the newsroom when suddenly actually the focus is no longer in a world of we can sort of produce what we will because advertising will subsidize it, and it is a world of a monopoly broadcast and kind of take it or leave it from the audience perspective. Suddenly, if 60% of our revenue and growing is coming from readers paying for it, and we're depending on growing that fraction, or growing that percentage, then we have to be a lot more interested in readers than we ever were before, which is why my job exists, actually, as head of audience engagement. Suddenly we care a lot more about how we get readers interested in paying for content. So even from a newsroom perspective, what does this mean? Well, it means that we actually have to think about, not just the way we used to sell content as a business. It was, well, in the first early days of print or digital, it was you could get a print subscription and you could get a digital subscription. And we figured that they weren't the same people or they weren't the same audiences. In reality, we have to completely shift the way we now think about how we value our content. And it's less about, well, it's worth this in print and worth this in digital, and less about device than it is about the actual understanding what value we bring to an audience. And thinking that maybe not all audiences will actually pay the same amount of content. So what does that mean? That means concretely we have to think about, well, how do we sell more people more content? We have to price it differently for different people. And this actually affects the journalism. It means that, well, we used to offer a standard subscription and a premium subscription. And again, it was take it or leave it. And now it's more thinking about, well, what are you willing to pay for? And do we maybe think about different audience cohorts and what they actually need, and actually maybe begin to produce content that they need? I'll give a concrete example. So more and more, it's about specialization. And it's about increasingly thinking about what people will be willing to pay for in a world in which there's so much free content. So we've just started developing a lot more focused content around deals and deal making, and creating a specific hub called Due Diligence, which is all about deals and deals making. And it has a newsletter dedicated to it, and it has a special hub, and it has a news feed, and it has dedicated reporters, and it has a lot of social interaction, and it has events. And this is basically a way of thinking about how do we get readers interested in something that is of extra value, or what is valuable to them. Concretely also, it means that because it's so important to understand what is valuable to readers and what readers will pay for, from a journalistic perspective, we need to understand in real time what they're actually engaging with. So it used to be, even just like 5 minutes ago, all about reach. We need to reach more readers and get more readers at the top of the funnel, if you understand the funnel metaphor, getting more new people in who might sample the journalism and eventually pay for it. Or in a BuzzFeed model, it was about getting more and more readers to consume the content, because there was also a kind of numbers monetization around sheer volume of readers. We've now moved away from bringing more and more readers in to actually getting the readers we have to stick around longer, getting readers that we are already paying for content to continue paying for content, and getting them to stay and read more and remain more engaged. So rather than constantly thinking about developing new audiences and reaching young readers and reaching other readers and reaching the ones that we don't yet have, we're actually now, from the Financial Times' perspective at least, more and more engaged and more and more focused on understanding what are people going to be willing to stick around and not only pay for, but pay more for. So that actually translates into producing specifically new content for new revenue, for not so much new people who might be willing to come who never paid before, but actually getting the same people to pay more money than what they were paying before. And finally, it also means that sometimes you just have to take a punt, right? You have to, Raju talked a lot about diversification of revenue streams and being sort of scattered across a portfolio of different ways of bringing in money. From an editorial perspective, it also means thinking about, well, sometimes we have concrete evidence about what is valuable to readers, and that means we have to be focused on understanding how to deliver more of that to them so they'll stick around and pay for it or pay more for it. And sometimes it's also about using a really good editorial instinct and thinking, well, is this a good idea? Is this something people would pay for? Let's test it and try it. But it really is about testing it and trying it with a view of eventually charging for it. And if it's not something that people won't pay for, it's not probably something that we'll continue producing.
That's a pretty strong finishing line. I think those who work in other news organizations might wonder what their content, the journalism they do would look like if they only produced things that people were willing to pay for. Renee, can I maybe ask you a follow-up question, and then I'll go through the panel again. In some ways, I mean, lots of newspaper journalists in the past, they worked for their advertisers. And now what you describe at the FT is a world in which you work for your readers. Is that a challenge for the journalistic profession to switch from a mindset? I think Jenny Lee earlier at the festival described this as a sort of prescriptive mindset. Here are some things we like, please pay attention to it and pay for it, to a mindset of what do you like, and can we help you understand the world in a way that you find valuable? How does that work out at the FT?
I mean, it's a really good question. It's a really loaded question as well. But
Somewhat.
But it's the right one because there is obviously a balance. There's a shift in the balance of power, right? We're no longer distributing to this captive audience. To some extent, we are only as good as the readers who will pay for our content, or consume it in some way that it generates revenue in many of the ways that Raju and Janine have outlined. But in reality, from a newsroom or journalist perspective, journalists have always wanted people to read their stuff. They just never knew whether they were reading it before or not. You were writing for your editor, or you're writing for your mother, or you were writing for some sense of pleasing an audience, but you didn't have any real measure of it. Well, the thing is, now we know. We actually know what people are coming and reading, but we also know who they are, what the demographic is, where in the world they're coming to that content, what proportion of what kind of story they're reading relative to another kind of story. Even as a newsroom, journalists have a much clearer picture of what is actually working and isn't working. That doesn't necessarily change what they feel is the right story, what they feel is an imperative to cover, what they feel is indispensable news and is valuable and part of the mission of something called the Financial Times to cover, but it's actually incredibly useful to understand how to allocate resource. So again, to give a concrete example, you're a reporter who's pitching the editor, and what you really want now as a reporter is to get your story on the homepage. Well, if you have a good understanding of what a really important story is, but also what a really important story that works is, i.e. that will get readers to come, to stay, to consume more, you might actually be able to inform your own reporting. You might actually think a bit more about pitching a certain kind of story. So it's not at the mercy of audience demand. It's not commissioning by numbers. It's not in a culture of necessarily producing what, you gave a really funny example before of I don't know what it was, but it's very funny.
Fidget spinner?
Yes, exactly. Well, we know that fidget spinners. Well, let's write a really engaging story about fidget spinners because that's going to go viral and social. But there is a notion of, well, if it seems like fidget spinners are bringing in readers who then come and read more content and actually might stick around and pay for it, maybe we should bring in a fidget spinner reporting. So it's a way of being informed by insights and not so much led by them.
if you ever come across a salmon-colored fidget spinner, you will know where the idea originated. Janine, you started by sort of prefacing your opening remarks with the idea that they were low in fact, and then you gave a sort of incredibly insightful and fact-based disposition of how BuzzFeed works as a business. But I mean, in your view and in your experience, how much should journalists and perhaps particularly top editors, how much should they know and think about the business that underpins their work?
Well, it is disingenuous and naive to suggest that we shouldn't, because of course we do, and it affects everything you do. I mean, I'd just say a couple of observations that I don't think journalists. I don't think I've ever met a journalist who thinks they work for an advertiser. I would just say that. I think journalists have an acute awareness of their audience, if not their business model, and if not their CPM. But they, even the sort of the grand tradition of tabloid newspapers in the 80s when they were in their full pomp, you know. When Rupert Murdoch was launching Sky TV in the UK, he had no idea what to price anything. He'd sort of built this business and no idea how much he should charge. So he phoned the editor of The Sun and said, "How much would your readers pay for this?" And Kelvin Mackenzie went, 150 quid? That's what it was. You know, that 50 quid, I don't know. But that was, Kelvin Mackenzie did not need market research or an army of consultants. Kelvin Mackenzie went, that. And that it wasn't. He knew his readers. He knew a Sun reader. He could spot one at 150. I think journalists are keenly aware of who they are writing for, whatever discipline of content generation they are in. And I also think that knowing your audience intimately, really intimately, is not just about getting them to pay directly for content. I would posit that BuzzFeed knows its audience as absolutely as intimately or effectively as anyone that takes registration data or credit cards from their readers or consumers or viewers. And that's because they live their audience. They spend a lot, you know, we spend a lot of time, we talk about ID posts. You know, when you're doing a quiz about which Sex and the City character you are, that's, you know, we've thought about that. It's funny, but we've thought about it. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the mood state that makes you share something, which seems trivial and tiny when you're talking about which Sex and the City character are you or which dog most embraces your spirit animal. But when it comes to, if the read across for a room full of news journalists is when we pitch an investigation that reporters have spent many years working on to, you know, bring a story to light that they hope will change the world, they know and they draw on the expertise of what is the mood state, what is the need in your head that makes you share that with someone else. Because the sharing and the peer-to-peer passing on of that story gives it power and impact. And that has a direct read across to the value of the news operation in the world.
But doesn't the sharing also generate revenue?
It does now because we have some display revenue, but it didn't. That wasn't the initial basis for BuzzFeed. It was about the knowledge of why people share content, and then basically working with that knowledge with advertisers that goes, we can make a much more powerful, effectively ad for you than you can, because we know how to get people to share the 15 things that you want to see on Netflix this spring. And so on. And I have forgotten what your question was because I got off on one. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think just to be clear, I didn't mean to suggest that those who offer news for free at the point of consumption work for their advertisers. It's the advertisers who deliver the money that funds it. That's true. But of course, part of the genius of what all of you do at BuzzFeed is that you understand your audience and you get their attention, right? And that is the biggest investment all of us make in news, is the attention that we pay to it, and you are very good at that. I wonder if you can say maybe a bit more about how you think of that mix between the editorial talent and judgment. You described that from The Sun, but of course you exercise that yourself as an editor too, the judgment, the creative side of this, and then the role of metrics. I mean, Renee said some things about the role of metrics as the FT, and of course BuzzFeed is famous for also working very seriously with data and metrics. So what role does that play in how you run BuzzFeed editorially, but perhaps also as a business?
Well, I mean, one of the metrics that we look at most closely is one that's pretty bespoke, which is the social lift, we call it, which is the ratio of traffic that we get from people sharing something. So we sort of separate out the traffic that we get from publishing something on the site, and then we have a ratio that we talk about internally on top of that, which is much more important and talked about much more than the top line number. We don't really talk about the top line page impressions for a story. We talk about that did an 8.2. And you would think, what the hell's an 8.2? And that is the ratio that we create around, Renee sent it to 20 of her friends, and then her 20 of her friends put it onto somebody else, and that's the sort of uplift, the magic sauce that sends a story really into the world. And we think about that a lot, but we're much more likely to talk about what is the frame under which we publish that content. What is the way we sold that story to you that made you first click on it and then think, oh yeah, that's what I want to send that to these people, or I want to tweet it, I want to post it, I want to share it, I want to dark social it via WhatsApp or whatever. And so, again, what I'm saying is we are trying all the time to understand you rather than trying necessarily to unpick the data. Other people at BuzzFeed spend a lot of time trying to unpick the data. You asked me to articulate what editors do. And I think it's, and I also should be really clear, I don't think it's a competition. I don't think one of us is right. I hope to God not one of us is right. I mean, ideally, there should be all of us thriving in our different ways with our different models. And we also ought to be able to, I think, borrow from each other a bit. You know, when the FT did its brilliant story earlier this year about the President's Club, which was such an important and fantastic piece of journalism, and really important for the FT to have done that, because that was speaking truth to its readers intimately and its power base. They put it outside the paywall, and they put it out into the world to make sure it sort of got the biggest audience possible. And that should be...
Right, and should be noted that we generated almost 0 subscriptions from it.
Right.
Because that wasn't the objective.
Right, so when we talk about should we stop everything that we don't think people would pay for, that's sort of the wrong prism. You know, we should be able to isolate things, and if we did stop everything that we didn't think people should pay for, then we'd need a really big state-funded media of some sort, and that's highly problematic.
Highly problematic indeed. Raju, Renee describes at the FT how, amongst other things, there is a clear focus on creating and doing journalism that people are willing to pay for. And Janine describes a focus at BuzzFeed on doing journalism that people find so engaging that they want to share it with their friends. It's sort of a very clear focus on a primary metric in both organizations. What you describe at Gizmodo is a very mixed picture, and I suppose sometimes one person's diversity can be another person's confusion. So how do you think about that in terms of how you make informed decisions in Gizmodo when you're doing all these different and sometimes perhaps somewhat contradictory things at the same time? Or is there a God metric in Gizmodo too?
Well, there are a couple of operating principles for the newsroom, and just to be clear, I don't commit any acts of journalism as CEO, so it's it's fairly church and state in that regard. And the two operating principles are related but slightly different. The first one is this idea around truth leads to trust and it leads to transactions. Right? That's the basic principle of all of our journalism, which is like those of you who visit our sites know that we are kind of in your face. There's a bit of a truth telling that is sometimes uncomfortable, but that leads to a lot of trust in the brands and that leads to a lot of transactions, because that's the related model is this idea of like great content plus great community leads to great commerce. Right? So most of, I don't take any credit for it. Nick Denton built this company when it was Gawker. The entire platform and the journalism and the way it's done is built around this idea that we are a place not just for content, but for conversations. The Kinja platform makes it very easy to kind of comment on. We occasionally, regularly actually have like a 400-word story and 400 comments. The reporters go in it, and there's a lot of like back and forth. Last year, we had 11 million comments on our kind of platform. So I think those are the principles that let us kind of then turn that into a commercially viable business as well. And it's done, I mean, the commerce team is independent of the newsroom, but because we don't have any relationships with the products, they are free to say that, I'll give you an example. They're free to say things like, if you're looking for a home exercise machine and you only have $100, you're a complete idiot, because for $100 you're not going to get good stuff. But if that's the only money you have, we looked at 3 of these. 2 of these are really, really horrible. We don't recommend you buying it, but hey, knock yourself out if you want to. This 3rd one seems okay. And all of them will have links to Amazon so people can go buy. We have no relationship with the actual exercise machine companies. So we can say we can speak the truth about the products as well, and that's what gives our readers the confidence that this is, I like this place, I trust them, and it's funny, it's irreverent, and hey, I'll buy this product. So I think that's the way to think about the interplay of journalism and the commercial side, right? I think church and state, all of our newsrooms have a very acute understanding of that, and some of it also because we come from backgrounds that kind of believed in that. And that still persists, but I think within that you can still make very viable business. Look, we've talked about like all the ways you can kind of make money, and you can add, obviously, Janine talked about podcasts, you can talk about creating shows for Amazon. So you're getting to about 12 to 15 different ways a media company can make money. Or you could play the billionaire sweepstakes and try to find a Bezos, right? That's a whole different model. But a couple of points that I just want to circle back on. Renee made an important point that we spend a lot of energy on getting new people to pay and getting new readers. A lot of the smart media companies are focusing that energy on reducing churn, right? Keeping them longer, keeping the subscribers longer, which is why the whole idea of thinking about our audience as visitors, readers, subscribers, and members, and trying to move them down that funnel makes a lot of difference. Because if you get a member, you keep them for a long time. You're not spending a lot of money trying to get new members. You do that if you're losing a lot. I think the smart companies, most people haven't paid a lot of attention, but the New York Times has done a remarkable job of keeping a majority of the Trump bump that they got. Right? So I think they're in a much stronger position coming out of this for the next several years, simply because they focus on churn. So I think revenue is important, how to make money is important, but how to keep people, how to get more of their time, because at the end of the day, we are not really, while we compete, I'm not competing with BuzzFeed or the FT, because digital audiences now are so promiscuous, they can go anywhere because of our devices. So all I'm competing for is the single non-renewable resource my readers have, which is their time. And if I get a minute more of that, how I monetize it is my problem, but it's a happy problem.
Happy problems indeed. Let's open it up for some questions, and then we'll take a lightning round towards the end on how journalists should engage in these discussions around business. But let's get some questions, please. Here in the first row. Sorry, there's a mic coming. Just give one. There, 1 second.
Hey, I have a question for Renee. I'm wondering, because obviously when your subscribers pay for your content, you can either, make them pay more money for highly specialized, or try to engage new audiences and keep the price low. I'm just wondering what has worked better for FT.
It's a good question, to which there's not a single answer. So, but it actually allows me to sort of add a point to what Raju was saying, where I think increasingly as businesses and even as newsrooms, we're focusing on figuring out how to give more value to the audience we already know and have. And so that sort of changes the way we even think about how we're trying to engage them. And it changes the way even how we think about what different journalism is worth. So I'll give a concrete example. There's some, some journalism is just not going to have the same volume of readers. It just won't. A very specialized section on capital markets and equity or currency will probably have a very small audience of engaged readers who we know are going to stick around for a long time, and it's probably very expensive to produce that journalism. And if you think about it, it's actually probably not even viable on its own. But there's a model of kind of cross-subsidization between the different kinds of content and the different kinds of audiences. So on the other hand, over here, we might be developing content that is very focused and specialized, and we know we can ask certain people or certain kinds of audiences will be willing to pay a lot more for that, which will then subsidize another kind of journalism that probably isn't viable on its own, but that is important to the broader mission, and also is important to the broader brand and the perception of what the FT is about. So that isn't exactly the answer to your question, but as a newsroom and as a business, we are very much focused way more on retention, and rather than sort of populating the top of the funnel or conversion. I mean, there are people, like, you have to bring them in, but even in the way we're thinking about how to metrics in the newsroom, we try to avoid talking about page views now, and we talk about article reads. And article reads for us are basically what percentage of the people who clicked through to the headline actually read through to what we consider more or less the end of the article. Like there's kind of a percentage based on the word length that we consider, okay, you read it. So we're much more focused on, did you actually engage with the content and consume it? And if you did, then that's probably the sign of engagement, of a successful piece of content. And it may also be content that we can then charge more for, potentially, or ask a certain cohort, if we give you more of that, or more of something like this, or in a format that you like better, maybe you'll pay more.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Also a question primarily to Renee. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how, in your experience, text quality relates to reader retention. I'm asking because we are both classically trained journalists. Actually, we worked for the German edition of Financial Times when it was still around, and we paid excruciating attention to text details, you know, and we can't run this to the readers, it's just too bad. And in our observation, text quality in a lot of primarily online media has kind of deteriorated. You can get away with stuff that would have never made print at the Financial Times. So, but a lot of these outlets seem to do very well, and there are also young paid media in Germany, and I cannot really read those texts because they're actually very bad. And but they seem to work for a lot of people. So I was wondering if in your experience, does classical text quality, classical handiwork play a role in reader retention, or do you need other aspects for reader retention? What is it that actually makes a good text that readers will pay for and stay as a paying customer?
Gosh, I don't think any of us could get away with bad quality. I mean, when you say text quality, I presume you mean like the actual quality of the writing and the reporting. You know, I don't think any brand, any viable brand, is going to be able to get away with anything that's not quality. I mean, especially because certainly from the FT's perspective, where reader revenue, people actually paying for the content, is the principal source of revenue, we're only as good as the quality of our content. But increasingly, as Raju points out, we're also competing not with each other, but we are competing with people's attention time. And on the one hand, you know, does that reduce the quality of the content? It can't reduce the quality of the content, because I think you then dilute the very identity of your brand, and the people who might be attracted to the less good quality journalism probably aren't paying for it. And
I can think of a very, very big English language site which has gone ruthlessly in pursuit of scale and display advertising, where you can be reading a story and halfway through the story will begin again.
Quite.
And just trail off and then bung another picture.
It's true, but
I'm not going to name them and shame them, but you all know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, but are any of us competing for those readers?
Right.
Probably not.
We're probably competing for some of their time and attention.
True.
I read that site, and I read your site.
True.
In the way that Raju says, we all on different devices do different. Who doesn't want to see someone flaunting their pins every so often?
You're absolutely right. It's true. If it is attention time, we are competing with the thing that will distract you on your phone. But I think certainly from the FT's perspective, that's a slippery slope. Yeah. Where we're only worth the power of our brand, and our brand is indissociably linked to quality. So there's a perception of people, and now people are, consumers are pretty sophisticated. They know that whole digital, clickbait thing. Oh, that's a clickbait headline. People sometimes write us, that was a clickbait headline. The FT is going down this slope. Well, people are aware of it. So you can't sort of pass a quick one over on them. Certainly that would be my point of view. Yeah.
Mark?
I'm just trying to...
Can I pose the follow-up question?
There are a couple more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, guys. We tend to talk about a binary choice between advertising and subscription, like paywall or advertising. But in the middle, a lot of people are talking about alternatives to going in and buying your $9 subscription or $10 subscription, possibly around paying for a better user experience, ad-free. We've scrolled Tony Hale's initiative. Discrete payments around event-based products, micro-payments. So how would you be advising publishers who are looking at the idea of saying, well, we're never going to have necessarily the kind of FT traction for that high-level, high-quality subscription, but we think we can get people to pay directly in some form, even if it's metered? How do you guys think about that?
I mean, maybe I can say some rude things and then people can say some nice things. I think the rude thing first is to say, I think we can consider it a fact that most of the journalism that's published on the web is not worth paying for. It's not an accident that people are not paying for it. It's because it's not worth paying for in their experience. And just, hammering up a paywall around low-quality journalism is obviously not going to solve the business problems of many publishers. So if you want to produce something that people are supposed to pay for, it has to create value for them. And then, of course, there are many other ways in which you can capture that value than through making them pay for it. And both Janine and Raju have explained some of the ways in which they do that. And of course, the FT does other thing than reader revenue too. But of course, there is this question for the people who want people to contribute. Are there other ways than just this bundle, which the FT is fundamentally still primarily a single bundle, though you are looking at new options. But maybe we can start with Raju. You were
yeah, I think it's a good question, Mark. The way to think about this is really around what is the value exchange, and there are different ways of creating value to a reader, a potential reader, and a potential paying subscriber, right? Sometimes it's straight saying pay for content, which is the subscription model, and there is a reason why I don't think that my brands lend themselves to a subscription, because while we think they're unique in their voice and tone, there are 10 tech sites that write about the same things that Gizmodo writes about, right, on a daily basis. So the idea that somehow Gizmodo is so unique that you have to pay for it and not find it anywhere else, I think it's a bit of a hard sell. That's why we are thinking in terms of memberships. And that's where the question is, what is the value exchange? So it's possible, ad-free, as you mentioned, is a clear model that a lot of people are embracing. I worry about it, by the way. There's a conventional wisdom that 80%, 90% of digital advertising is going to Facebook and Google, so that's kind of a lost battle. Yes, but remember, digital advertising is only 37% of all advertising spending in the world today. And that number is going to go way up. It's going to go to 40 in a couple of years. It's going to get to 50. It's going to get... So we should be very careful of encouraging ad-free models to get a little bit of reader revenue from that, while you may be actually walking away from a growing pie, even though you're only 10% of that pie that you can go after. I would still want to be in a position where if digital advertising is growing, still go pretty hard at that 10% of a growing pie, right? Rather than take a little bit of money from a few people who don't like ads. So I think it's important for us to when we think about these models, are we creating bad habits that are going to come and bite us later? I think it's important to think about. So I think the framing of this is and we could, for example, we could actually use things like print as a way to create value, right? I mean, The Onion used to be a print publication a long time ago. So, for example, we could potentially have a membership offering where from members, every quarter, you get an Onion print magazine back. Right? Create a little bit of scarcity out of something that they don't have. So I think there are lots of ways to think about that, and you're right in terms of it's not just a binary, give me money. And I think increasingly, if any of us adds up all the things we are paying for, it's starting to add up to a pretty significant number now between Spotify, Netflix, and all those things. So I think there's going to be a point when readers are going to say, I really don't want to, I love the New York Times, I love the Washington Post, I love the Journal, but I can't afford to pay each one of them separately. You're starting to see the emergence of Blendle and post-Blendle kind of bundling of it. The biggest worry I have is that we are spending so much energy, each of us, on thinking about how to get somebody to pay for our brands. In the US, for example, if AT&T gets CNN, if Verizon gets its act together with AOL, Yahoo, and all of that, and Comcast already owns big chunks of a lot of media companies. These guys already send a monthly bill to millions of people that we never pay attention to, right? Our phone bill and our internet bill. I can imagine a scenario where Verizon will send me a note saying, for $2 more, I'm going to give you all of my media, plus I have all special access to NFL and all these things. That's so frictionless that I worry that these, I call them melcos, media and telcos getting together, that they would come and completely upend all of our energy on subscriptions. So I think there's just a lot to kind of keep thinking about, but it always has to be a value exchange.
I mean, I would agree with almost everything that Raju just said, including that, and I really don't speak for BuzzFeed on this, I'm speaking as a former media journalist, but it has seemed inevitable to me for some time that the tube providers, the telcos, who capture a great deal of money, an increasing amount of money direct from the people that pay for access to that, need content. And And that just seems inevitable. And you watch all the mergers that are going on, as you say, there just is there's a hoovering, a massive vertical hoovering up that's going on. And I would say, just on the knowing your audience thing, micropayments, no matter how frictionless, will work for certain demographics. And if you are, inevitably, if you are chasing a younger audience, if you are serving and responding to a younger audience, then that is less likely to work for you. And there is always going to be an important role for serving news, compelling news and entertainment to younger audiences. They're harder to reach. If you can find them, then that's great. And we give up on advertising at our peril. Advertisers need compelling content to be around, and quality advertisers want to be around quality content and a quality relationship.
There's a question in the back there.
Hi, my name's Inga. I work for CNN, soon to be AT&T, obviously. I just wanted to kind of flip that question a little bit around, you know, the quality of the content and talk about the user experience, because we can have the most amazing journalism and then it's packaged with, you know, dodgy display ads, even worse programmatic ads, and we're expecting the audience to kind of read through this and be bombarded with, you know, if you're over 50, this is the skincare you clearly need, or if you're under a certain age, you get, you know, whatever the cookies are telling them. And then at the bottom, you'll get potentially in BuzzFeed saying, and now buy the fidget spinners, or in my case, here's a lot of outbrain, potentially, you know, brand damaging content. So I'm just wondering how long we think that the audience is going to tolerate the kind of user experience that those programmatic ads, the display ads, are giving them, and to as much as you know about companies, for example, like Scroll, how much they are the answer to getting a better user experience and still getting fair pay for our journalism.
To answer one piece of that very quickly, Inki, I mean, it's a good question, and I think user experience, and this to some extent addresses, I think, Mark's question a little bit too. A good user experience is something that people will pay for. And so maybe actually part of the way we think about how to encourage readers to pay for content, or indeed at least engage with it, whatever the value exchange is, part of the value exchange might be, I'm happy to pay, but it has to be incredibly easy and seamless. I don't want to have to take out my credit card. Or I'm happy to pay, but it has to be through social. Or I'm happy to pay, but I have to be able to try it before I buy it. Or I'm happy to stick around and read and stay longer and consume more of your content, but it has to be an ad-free zone. And so, you know, the value exchange may not actually be money for content. It might be something else for engagement, or something else for time spent on your site. And I think certainly what we're trying to do now at the Financial Times is actually, both on an editorial level, but also on a commercial level, figure out what are those value exchanges? Where are the different places, and what are the different things that we can be exchanging? You know, GDPR is something for anybody who's based in Europe, which is, you know, quite massive and terrifying and coming to us in 3 seconds. But GDPR, you know, raises all these requirements, obviously, for those of you who aren't familiar, about what kind of information we can host. Well, that also, however, gives us the opportunity to say, well, actually, it is now valuable for me to get your consent to be able to market to you, right? If you give me some of this information, I'll give you some content. That may create a new exchange. So maybe if you give me some of your information, I won't serve you ads, but then I can give you something else later. So I do feel like actually user experience is a way that you can actually, is a good and an experience that, and a value that you can trade on.
Yeah, of course.
And also, the converse can also be true. You will pay for uninterrupted viewing pleasure on Netflix, and you will sit there and go, there's no ads, and it's wonderful, and I can watch 18 shows back to back, and I haven't watched a single ad, isn't that great, and I'll pay all this money. And if you really want to watch it, you'll watch it on YouTube on a screen that big on your phone, backwards, with 14 ads going at the same time and somebody jumping all over it. And if you are under 30, you'll do it, I don't know, for 4 hours at a time. And if you're under 20, you'll do it again in a foreign language with subtitles over it. So,
you're right. I mean, it depends on the audience.
Right, it absolutely depends on where you are and how much you want it.
Right. Yep.
There were some terrifying moments when we did focus groups in 2017 where, amongst other things, we asked people what fake news meant to them with ordinary media users. And one of the most frequently mentioned examples by focus group participants were around the web links. That was what people considered an example of fake news. That's fairly terrifying for a lot of publishers. So.
Yeah, my big fear about ad-free experiences is that These are very lazy newsrooms not addressing the difficult problem of user experience. And they're saying, let's take out all the ads, right? Which is pretty dumb, I think, right? Unless you're a news organization that doesn't believe in ads at all, right? That's a different model. You're not taking it out for individuals. Look, my biggest problem with the CNN website isn't ads. It is the autoplay of video. It drives me insane, right? Forget about Taboola and Outbrain and all that nonsense you have at the bottom. It's the top that I'm worried about.
Duly noted. Please.
Tell Mitra.
So I love all the talk of mixed revenue streams because I'm about to launch a paywall on a magazine website, but we also have lots of advertising. That's how we make our money. There are obviously lots of commercial things and UX things that you have to deal with there. The thing that I'm sort of really concerned about, because I just don't know what's going to happen, is I have a team of journalists who are good writers, but have got very good at getting mass audiences. They don't do so clickbait necessarily, but they do sort of responsible political analysis, which is very good at spreading across the web effectively on social media. They've got really good at that when we had a mass appeal approach. We're going to introduce a paywall, and we still need the mass audience, but we also need articles and content that's going to, make people flick and actually pay for that content and take out a relatively expensive subscription. How do you juggle those two competing kind of approaches, the mass approach and the quality approach or the subscription approach with your editorial team? Do you need different people? Are journalists better suited to the mass approach or the sort of quality making people pay approach? How would you manage that kind of split editorial problem?
It's a really good question that actually comes up in the newsroom all the time. And I mean, that is the great existential question, right? You trade reach for return. And what is the right balance? What is the right trade-off? And I don't actually think anybody has it quite figured out, and it's often going to evolve. But to answer that question quickly, you basically have to give your newsroom an objective. And whatever the metric is, that is a reflection of what you want to do. As it happens in the FT newsroom, it's engagement, and we define what engagement is. And so when a journalist says, well, wait, do I want to reach lots of new readers, or do I want to reach subscribers? You have to say, well, both, but maybe in this proportion. So it comes down to what is the objective commercially, what does good return look like, and how many readers do we need to be paying, and how much time. And so what does that look like in terms of your social reach? Do you trade off there? And you experiment.
We'll finish with a lightning round on the panel itself. So the whole implicit premise of the panel, and Janine stated it explicitly, is that there is not one model for the future of the business of news. There are different models. It's also clear that journalists need to know what is the model that their organization has, or at least aspires to. But I think one thing that we've heard slightly different views on, that all of you will be thinking about in your organization, is what is the role of journalists in defining and developing those models? So maybe a last round from the panel on what do you see as the role of journalists themselves in developing the future of the business of news?
Well, I think most business models just start with good journalism, right? I mean, that's the beginning and the end of everything. If you don't have that, then you really don't have any models or any ability to experiment. I think I would like all of my journalists to be data informed and not necessarily data driven. I think there's a substantial difference in that, right? So for them to want to understand what's happening, I think is important. They don't need to act on it and kind of respond to those cues. But so being more data informed and having a sense of what is it that pays for us to expand our journalism and asking the questions and being able to get the answers. I think that's critical, and not happening as much as we would like it to in most newsrooms.
I think the journalist's role is to know the audience, and nobody should know the audience, the reader, the watcher, better than the journalist who is writing for or creating for them, who knows what questions to ask on their behalf, and to understand what they want to see and know, almost implicitly, or without thinking about it, instinctively rather. So that's what I think journalists bring to the business model discussion.
Yeah, I think they need to be focused on producing great digital journalism, which is, and at the heart of producing great digital journalism is knowing your audience.
Terrific. With that, please join me in thanking the panel.
We only had a churn of about 10% in the discussion about business models, so it's not terrible. We retained almost 80% of our audience.